What is something you did as a kid that heavily impacted your parents, but you didn't know until later in life? Mine isn't really moving or inspirational or anything, but when I was younger, my parents asked me if I wanted to have a sibling and I told them no because I was just thinking in terms of being a spoiled only child since I was young. I later realized that my mom had extreme difficulty getting pregnant with me in the first place and had always felt pressure to the point of depression to have another child because she thought that I would grow up being lonely without a sibling. She's a twin who has always been best friends with her sister. By me saying that I didn't want to have a sibling, it lifted a huge weight off her shoulders and she came out of depression eventually. Frick off. That is moving as crap. For my dad's 40th birthday, we decided to drive to Disney World from PA, a 17-hour drive. He's a big deadhead. My older brother, 13, and I, 9, decided to use my brother's computer to make him a mix. But in a very sneaky way, we make a fake creative writing prompt for my English class as a way to ask him what his favorite playlist would be. He was none the wiser. On the third CD of the mix, we slipped a song in of us singing him happy birthday. I didn't know at the time, but apparently it was the night shift that song came on. The combination of all his favorite songs on this thoughtful mix and his son singing him happy birthday was overwhelming. He pulled over, woke my mom up, and they cried together from happiness. I never knew about it until a few years ago. As a father, I can say, that's quite possibly the coolest gift ever. When I was 9, I told my mom that she would die of cancer and leave me an orphan if she didn't stop smoking, and she stopped smoking up until 2 years ago. My mom used to travel a lot for her job when I was a little kid, so much so that when I once drew a family picture, she wasn't in it. She stopped traveling as much, even though it paid her more, and got a job that was paid less but kept her at home most of the time. I only found out about this a couple months ago. It made me feel awful. My dad traveled overseas for a month or more at a time for work. When she was very small, my sister told my mom, "I don't remember what daddy looks like. He dropped everything and came home." When I was 10, I said to my mom, "Why are you married to dad? He's not even nice to you." She filed for divorce like a week later. When I got older, she brought up the story, and it kind of freaked me out. Obviously their marriage sucked bus before that, but it was weird to find out that something a 10-year-old said made such a huge impact. Not me, but my grandpa was reading the letters his parents sent to each other while his father, my great-grandfather, was away in the Navy in World War II. He found a letter from his mother that said, "Was going to ask you to come home on hardship leave." They owned an important store in town and it would have been a legit request. But young, Grandpa Nominal, was bragging to his friends today about how his daddy would never chicken out and use hardship leave, and I just couldn't do it. He broke down and cried. My grandpa was only 5 years old at the time, and didn't really know what he was saying. My great grandpa lived, luckily, but that was years of war he might not have gone through. I broke my arm very badly when I was 6. It was so messed up that they almost amputated. We had just moved from CA to WA and didn't have health insurance. My grandfather put up his home as collateral for me to have the, at the time, very innovative reconstructive surgery. I now have a plastic joint, pins, and donor tissue. It's a small miracle that my arm works at all. Here's what I didn't remember. Only mom and I had moved. I remember dad had to stay behind for work. At the time he was a pretty popular recording artist, but that's just what they had told me. They were actually separated. Dad didn't want to quit music drugs. Mom wanted a cleaner, simpler life. When he got word that I had surgery, he drove straight through to get to WA. While here, he decided to stay and get a real job with health insurance. TLDR. My broken arm led to my parents' reconciliation, the end of my father's music career, and eventually the end of his speed addiction. That's a very moving story. When I was in the primary school in Croatia, there was this optional flat fee you could pay and the kids would be served lunch, not like shop style lunch in US. Obviously, if you were not happy with the food they provided or for whatever other reason you could choose to not pay it and give your kids sandwiches or whatever. But nearly everyone paid it and so did my parents. 1 month. In the 3rd year I had forgotten to tell my parents when the payment is due. I told them something like 3 days before it was due, and due to a terrible financial condition we were in, my dad forgot to account for the lunch fee. Times were difficult after the Yugoslav wars and my parents were struggling, but they always took great care for me not to feel any of it. But this time, my dad couldn't find money from anywhere. He even asked to borrow money. Keep in mind that this was a relatively low fee, something like $15. No luck. I simply went back to the teacher and told her that I was not gonna go to lunch this month. No big deal. I get 10 more minutes to play soccer or whatever. Didn't bother me, but it hit him immensely. This was the first time that he had to concede that he couldn't provide food for his children. First time when he needed to pay to feed his child and he simply couldn't. Same day he started researching his options. He got a second job. Spent days on the computer and phone, every minute of free time he had. About 3 months later, I had restarted getting the lunch following month. He and my mum called me and my brothers in for a family meeting and asked about how we would feel if we were to move to Australia or Canada. I didn't really care. Seemed cool at the time. We said yes. So they initiated the immigration process. Pulled some strings, and within a year we were packing our whole life into 5 suitcases and moving to Australia, where we knew about 3 people and had no family and knew nobody and nothing. Years later, my father admitted that the inability to pay my lunch fee was the straw that broke the camel's back, and whenever they ask him why he moved to Australia he says that he couldn't feed his children in Croatia. Even though I never really went hungry. TLDR. I forgot to tell my dad about the school lunch fee. His response was to move our whole family to the other side of the world. Last week, I received an email from my daughter's teacher. They were doing a project on who is the most inspiring person to them. Most of the kids put cartoons, superheroes, movie stars, singers and the like, and so the teacher was able to have the kids print those pictures off the net. It turns out my daughter listed me, so would I be so kind as to reply with a picture of myself? I was a blubbering mess for a good half hour. I don't do drugs or frick in front of her, but I'm not exactly father of the year either. I'm now much more aware of how I act around my daughter now that I realize how much kids pay attention to the things their parents do. Anyway, when she was born I set up a Hotmail account for her and I email the account once a week as sort of like a journal, telling her about the things she's done, or I've done, and what happened that week. I plan on giving her the password to the email address when she graduates high school, and I'm sure this email her teacher sent is one of those moments where she will realize the impact she's had on me. Yes, the emails are backed up. I hope you've logged into the account occasionally. They go inactive after a while. When my dad took me to Disney World he was still a smoker. One day after a fairly long day of rides and such I wanted to go on one more ride. He said okay, but first let me have a cigarette. I said nah, it's okay, we can head out then. He quit smoking then and there, cold turkey. I was about 5 at the time. Apparently I guilted my dad into sobriety, though I have no memory of it. Early Saturday morning, after cartoons, I tugged on his sleeve while he was sleeping off a hangover, and he rolled over and yelled "Bleogla me alone," so I screamed and ran away. He said the look of terror on my face convinced him to stop drinking. Reminds me of my dad's story. My older brother is mentally disabled, and my dad ran away from home on an alcohol coke binge when my brother was 4. He refused to speak to my dad on the phone when he called to let them know he was on his way to Texas, where his brother lived. This was my dad's wake-up call. His son was mentally disabled but knew that the fact that daddy was gone hurt him. When I was about 4 or 5, my father would be working in Washington DC from Monday to Thursday, while we lived in New York. One day I told my mother that it was like I only had a dad on weekends. This shook him so much that he changed jobs within 2 weeks of him hearing this, and now he is home around 8 PM every day. Cats in the cradle and a silver spoon. Little boy Blue and the man on the moon. This one is kind of odd, but when my parents divorced when I was just 6 years old, my mother kept the house we lived in and my father built a new house next door. All because of me. He didn't want to be an every other weekend dad even though he paid child support that way. I grew up in a small town and the 2 houses were probably 200 to 300 yards apart, with just some wood separating them. I had a bedroom at each house and would alternate houses each night. It created a weird dynamic but could see either parent whenever I wanted. Walking back and forth between houses day after day had worn out a pathway in the woods between the two houses. When I turned 18 and moved away, my mother also finally sold the house a couple years later and moved. Just recently I visited my father in my hometown and walked to the edge of the woods. There's no trace of that well-worn path anymore, but I can still see it in my imagination. That's freaking beautiful. This tore me up when I found out about it. My sister was 16 when I was 8 and at the time she and my dad did not get along at all. They would fight a lot and my sister would spend a lot of her time alone in her room. One night my sister and my father got into it pretty bad. After all the yelling stopped, I was sitting with my dad and I asked him something along the lines of, "Are you going to stop loving me too when I become a teenager?" Apparently this deeply moved my dad and he was determined to repair his relationship with his daughter. He went into her room that night to talk to her and began spending more time with her. They're still close to this day. Here's the real kicker. I was talking to my sister about her relationship with our dad and she said that she was severely depressed when she was a teenager. Apparently she was planning on killing herself, but in the course of the conversations she had with my dad, she revealed this to him. He got her into treatment. According to her, my dad saved her life. Even to this day I wonder if my innocent comment to my dad saved me from having to bury my sister. That is incredible. As sorry as I am that that happened in her past, I am extremely happy for you that through that little comment, you were able to keep your sister in this world. This is exactly the reason why I asked the question in the first place, to find moving stories like this. Thank you for sharing. My mom would travel for business for 5-6 months out of the year and my dad would travel free for 2. So one day I drew a picture of my family in preschool and I drew with my nanny and my parents with their suitcases waving bye to us. My parents promptly demanded to travel less and pretty much changed their lifestyles. My 18-month-old started pulling up my shirt to slap my fat belly, saying puku, puku, Maori word for belly. I've lost 22 kilograms and will run a half marathon next month. Just found out a few months ago that I liked pulling on my mom's earrings when I was a baby and eventually I ripped them both out one day. She had to have plastic surgery to fix her earlobes, but didn't have the money for the procedure until a few years later. I'm 22 now and she still wears her hair so that no one can see her ears. Feels bad, man. Babies always pull at earrings. Don't feel bad. Not my story but my son's. My son had a cough when he was a baby. It wasn't bad, but I couldn't figure out where it came from. I smoked, but not in the house or around him at all. One day he wanted picked up so I picked him up and he buried his face in my shoulder. He then lifted his head up, turned and coughed. That was the point I realized it was the smoke on my clothes that was making him cough. I've never felt so terrible. My bad habit was causing direct, visible harm to my son. I decided to quit right there and then. It took a few days to finally quit. Tried, failed, etc. But I was 3 years smoke free last December. My parents separated when I was in 5th grade, and they got back together when I was in 7th grade. I was happy with the separation. No more fighting. No more back and forth. It was great. When my parents considered getting back together, my mom asked me if it was okay. I said no, that they were better apart. My mom got really upset and screamed, "You're the reason I can never be happy." My parents are still together, but that moment impacted all of us. My mom and I aren't as close as we were, and in retrospect she realizes I was right. She loves him, but she doesn't want to be with him. She sticks around because marriage is a promise. It hurt my dad too, knowing I didn't want him back. Don't get me wrong, my dad is awesome, but they just shouldn't be together. TLDR. Don't ask a kid a question if you don't want an honest answer. Not me, but my older sister has a good one that really impacted my mom. She's 7 years older than me and maybe 4-5 years old at the time. She's sitting in the back seat of my mom's car on her way home from a play date or birthday party or something. She's telling our mom all about her friends, and she gets to this argument she had with some boy. Let's call him Timmy. I have no idea what his name actually was. She said something like this: and Timmy told me Santa wasn't real, but I said he has to be real because my mommy would never lie to me. Right, mommy? As this all happened before I was born, my mother was terrified to even suggest the idea that Santa is real to me. Rolled out of the top bunk onto the hardwood floor when I was 6. Went blind for 3 hours. Regained my eyesight in the emergency room and was fine after that. My dad built a wooden wall around the top bunk at 4 in the morning before he let me back up there to sleep. He called it a railing. There haven't been bunk beds in my extended family without a railing since then. Pretty small impact compared to many of the stories here, but I shudder every time I think about how terrifying those 3 hours must have been for them. I'm just baffled that the top bunk didn't have a railing already. I thought that was standard. When I was just little, I wanna say 2 or 3, I was in my high chair at the table. My mom was off doing something and my dad playing video games. My dad got up and started doing something else and noticed this. A 2 or 3-year-old boy, calmly sitting at the table in half-light, multi-lighted dining area, eating his dinner very politely without noise, complaint or a second thought. It hit my dad so hard, the saddest sight he says he's ever seen. His 2 or 3-year-old already adjusted to eating dinner alone. He stopped my mom. They came over and turned on the lights and sat down and talked to me while I ate. To this day, even though I'm 20 and trying to get life worked out on my own, they make sure I'm not too lonely. I love my parents. Typing that made me notice the onions that were being chopped in my room. Stupid onions. The image of a toddler solemnly eating Cheerios in the dark makes me crack up. Taped over my own birth video and video of my first weeks being alive and replaced it with cartoons. They didn't like Tom and Jerry much after that. Guess they should have pulled the tab out. I remember I loved sitting with my parents and watching TV at night. They'd usually do this after we went to bed, so I invented headaches that would keep me up so I could stay and watch TV with them. Well, I didn't know until a few years ago that these headaches I was having prompted my parents to take me to see a doctor. I remember very vaguely having an MRI done. They never found anything wrong with me and my parents never knew I was pretending to have these headaches. I told my mom this last year when I suddenly remembered that all of this happened. She was shocked, called me but I faked being sick to stay up with my parents too. But the best times ever were when they would let my brother and I sleep on the air mattress in the living room because it was too hot to sleep upstairs. No air conditioning in our bedrooms. So much Johnny Carson and SNL those summers. When I was 7, in the fall of 2nd grade, my dad passed away from an aneurysm. My entire 2nd grade class made me cards. It was a big thing. Fast forward to that April. There was a daddy-daughter dance at my school. I told my mom I wanted to go and naturally, she expected me to back out. The day of the dance rolls around and I had yet to back out. My mom helps me get dressed, asking me if I'm sure I still want to go. I assure her that I still want to go. After we get me ready, my mom takes me to the school and opens the car door. I hop out, tell her I love her, and walk into the daddy-daughter dance with my head held high, all by myself. Years later, my mom told me that she cried so hard when I got out of the car and that was the day she knew that I was the bravest person she'd ever met. My parents divorced when I was around 10, and my dad moved away from home. Me and my sister and my mom stayed in MA, USA while my dad went to Ohio. My mom had always framed the picture as this: mom was good and worked hard for us. Dad screwed us over. This is what I was brought up thinking. And my sister, mostly my sister, she hated my father because of this, so he had little to no contact with her even though he called every single night. No exceptions. He called me and I would answer and talk with him, because, thankfully, I was too young to really understand my mom's subtle but influential remarks about him that made my sister see him in a bad light, so I just thought of him as the guy I love. So fast forward a couple years, my dad went from working as a biotechnician in a house with a wife and kids to working in a pizza place in a crappy apartment alone. Obviously he had a horrible relationship with my mom and my sister refused to have one with him. Needless to say, depression came up to him fast. This was about the time I discovered the wonders of the internet, specifically Yahoo Chat and the games you could play. Circa 2004. Sorry, I have no idea when all this happened. For those who don't know, you could get into a chat with someone and invite them to flash games to play. I discovered Yahoo's Pool Simulator, the greatest multiplayer chat thing ever. I always invited my dad to play pool with me because, who do I know that would play this with me? He would accept every time. I spent hours with him on it. So we forwarded to about a year ago and we start recalling playing Yahoo Pool together. He told me that my contact with him and my treating him as someone who was desirable to be with lifted him up out of his depression greatly, and he wouldn't know where he'd be if I didn't do that. He eventually got into a job as a biotechnician again, making a massive amount of money, and remarried with a doctor, who makes an absurdly more vast amount of money. He is a millionaire now. In the past year my sister has come to love my dad as well, realizing my mom set her up to hate him, and feeling guilty she didn't think of him as I did over the years. And now my mom is a lot more open with him too. So, because I was a bored child who discovered Yahoo Chat Pool, I regave my dad his old happy life, or as close as he would get. TLDR. Me wanting to play Yahoo Pool lifted my dad out of depression and eventually made him a millionaire. Sort of. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.